Looks like the Minnesota Vikings are just going to let Sam Darnold leave. And it may be the right thing to do, but it's a stupid football decision. We'll discuss on today's edition of Locked On NFL.
The new Locked On NFL. The madman Tyler Rowland is your double shot of NFL espresso, with the Locked On local experts on every major story. Get ready, Rowland is revving up. The new Locked On NFL starts now. Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Football fans, welcome in to the Locked On NFL podcast, bringing you a double dose of the NFL's biggest stories with help from our local experts that know your favorite teams like no one else. I am your host, the madman, Tyler Rowland, joined today by Locked On NFL expert Lauren Cox. On today's episode, we're going to take a look at some of the biggest all-season storylines for the NFC North. Obviously, we have the Vikings, we have Lauren's Bears, we'll talk Packers, we'll talk Lions. But we got to start with the NFL franchise tag window opening, and that starts with the biggest name on the market, and it's Sam Darnold. Before we dive in, I do want to thank you for making Locked On NFL your first listen and for being an everydayer here with us at the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. Lauren, Sam Darnold, probably the biggest name free agent out there on the market, and normally you don't see players like that actually get to the market, but it looks like the Minnesota Vikings are going to let Sam Darnold go. And if you don't believe me, take it from Kevin O'Connell, Minnesota Vikings head coach. And my guy, Luke Braun from Locked On Vikings, discussed that recently.
And in fact, when asked about Sam Darnold, he used very specific wording. And it's wording we've heard before from Kevin O'Connell. He said, Sam Darnold has earned the right to be a free agent. And then talked, glowingly about everything he did and how much fun it was and how we would love to have him back, but blah, blah, blah. It's a business, and then all the platitudes, right? But he's earned the right to be a free agent. Now, that phrase stuck out to me a lot last year when Kevin O'Connell used it about Kirk Cousins. And what that ended up meaning was the Vikings have some pithy offer for Kirk Cousins. Hey, you can come back and play. Here's the 1-year deal we'll do. I think it was maybe it was like 1 and a fake year or something. Not fully guaranteed. Provisional, and we're going to bring a rookie. That's the package. Take it or leave it. And Cousins said, no, thank you. I can get 4 years from Atlanta. I'm taking that. My guess is that we are looking at a similar situation. And that's been my guess, and it's only corroborated by the fact that this is not the first time Kevin O'Connell has used that phrase, he's earned the right to be a free agent. I mean, how can you take that any other way than saying Sam Darnold's going to go be a free agent? Yeah, he's earned the right to go be a free agent, but we're not going to let him. Like, that's not going to happen, right?
I'm going to take Kevin O'Connell for his word, right? Like, they're going to let Sam Darnold go into free agency.
Yeah, it's funny, like, how Sam Darnold has become this big free agent name. Like, I'm really enjoying, like, wow, what are the Vikings going to do with Sam Darnold and how is this going to go? But I also feel like, and that was kind of the plan all along, right? I mean, it was 1 year, and he happened to do so much better than anybody thought he would. But like, the plan was always JJ McCarthy was going to take over in 2025 at the absolute latest, if not, earlier this season already.
Yeah, 100%. So I agree with you. It's probably one of those things like Russell Wilson starting for the Steelers when he's healthy. Like, they promised him it would happen. You got to keep your promise there. But let's just say the reality. Everybody always says, oh, it's a cold business. The NFL is such a cold business. Well, the Vikings could certainly be colder. Okay, I get that you promised Sam Darnold 1 year rehabilitation, let you back out into the wild. If you love something, let it go. It'll come back to you, right? All that nonsense. Well, either way, this is a stupid way to manage an asset. If you want to look at it as, the Vikings are doing the right thing by Sam Darnold, you're right about that. They are. But from a cold, hard business football management viewpoint, this is really, really dumb because you have a guy who clearly has value in the NFL, and they could tag Sam Darnold and then trade him, and he could still get the big time contract. They would actually get some value back for the asset that they repaired. It would be like buying an old crappy car, remodeling it and getting it back to shape and then giving it away for free. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. I know that there's we're human beings, right? The sentimental factor in that they're doing the right thing by Sam, but this is a pretty dumb thing to do with a football asset from a business standpoint.
I wonder if the Vikings look at some of the upcoming free agents they have on defense, Byron Murphy at corner, or Cameron Bynum at safety, and say, we probably feel like we might need to use the franchise tag on one of those guys and can't afford to use the tag on Darnold to get some extra value there, when you can say, okay, well, we'll tag the guy we actually want to maybe keep and then try and get a compensatory pick if Sam Darnold walks and gets a big contract elsewhere. Plus, I don't know exactly what the Sam Darnold trade market looks like there. I mean, is it a first round pick? Probably not. So then do you get closer to what a compensatory value pick would just be anyway?
Well, I mean, if somebody's out there thinking about trading for Derek Carr, or, if someone's going to consult the Jets about Aaron Rodgers, anything's possible. But yeah, the compensatory pick, if Sam Darnold leaves in free agency, they could get that back. That's probably not too far off. It'll probably be a third rounder because of how high the contract is. So that's probably not too far off from maybe a second round pick you would get from Sam Darnold to be able to jump the line. But that is a valid pushback of, hey, it's not so much that we want to give up the asset for free. It's we're going to lose out on these other assets that we do need around long-term in the defensive backs you mentioned. So that's a very good point. But with, Byron Murphy and Cam Bynum in mind, there are some other players who could get the franchise tag. We talked about T. Higgins on yesterday's show. Obviously, the biggest name outside of Sam Darnold that's in this conversation. Other options, maybe Javon Holland for the Dolphins, Trey Smith on the offensive line for the Kansas City Chiefs, Chris Godwin at wide receiver for the Bucs. I'll be honest with you, Lauren, going through all those names other than Higgins, I don't see a name that jumps out to me that's going to get the franchise tag. And again, a good point you brought up with Sam Darnold. It's not that you don't want to keep these players around, but you got to go into free agency with a high cap hit against your situation. Because when you give out these franchise tags, for example, $26 million for T. Higgins, rather than fudging the numbers with the contract, with the void years and the prorated signing bonus to deal with the cap hit, now you're taking that $26 million cap hit, and that's just $26 million on your cap with no bonus to prorate and all that stuff. So with that in mind, I think T. Higgins does get the tag because the Bengals just don't want to lose that player control. And if he goes into the free market, he's going to clean up and they're never getting him back. But other than that, I don't see anybody else, with Darnold not being an option, I don't see anybody else worth the franchise tag for those specific teams.
Yeah, I think, to me, if it's going to happen, it's going to be kind of like the L'Jarius Sneed thing last year with the Chiefs, right? Where it's a team that gives a player maybe even just a non-exclusive tag, not necessarily with the intent of then negotiating a better deal, but just with the intent of trying to trade him. And I don't know exactly how much wiggle room the Eagles have, but they have 4 big-time free agents that I'm not sure they're going to be able to actually keep any of them, or at least, not many of them at a big contract. So like, could they try and get something for Josh Sweat, Milton Williams, Mekhi Becton, Zach Bond, one of those guys? You tag them not with the intent of having all that salary cap on your books, because they can't afford to sit there with the tag for a long time. But if you know you're going to lose probably any of those 4 guys, all 4 of those guys anyway, tag one of them and get a draft pick for him would be something that I wouldn't put past Howie Roseman. But you got to make the numbers work, and you risk tagging him and not find a trade partner right away, and then having all that money locked up, and you're kind of screwing yourself there.
Yeah, for me, I would only be able to do a deal. I would only agree to do a deal like that with a player if the trade partner and compensation was already figured out, because then other teams really have you over the barrel of, hey, you have a deadline here to not tie up your free agent money with this with this franchise tag. So then they would kind of have you negotiation wise. So, but interesting way to do things. And hopefully we see some more creative stuff like that in the NFL going forward. I think kind of going back to the Brock Osweiler tried with the Browns, where it was more of a salary dump. We'll give you a pick to take this salary. That was a really creative move that you see in basketball more than football. So it'll be interesting to see if anything like that shakes down. But the franchise tag deadline window to tag a player is from Tuesday, the 18th, until March the 4th, I do believe is the day. It's like a 2-week window there. So we'll be interesting to see who gets the tag, who doesn't get the tag, and what can unfold there. And we'll be here on Locked On NFL to break it all down. But now let's take a look at the NFC North. Detroit Lions should trade for Myles Garrett. We'll break it down. It's Locked On NFL, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game. So even if you miss opening tip-off, or you want to bet a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. If you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same game parlay. Boy, do I love a same game parlay. I also love using FanDuel's live betting feature because it keeps every moment of the game exciting, whether I'm backing my team for a late game rally or picking a player to hit a clutch three. I never feel like I missed my chance. Plus, the app is easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, Lauren, let's continue today's edition of Locked On NFL. We talked about the franchise tag, the window opening, some candidates that could be available. It doesn't seem like we'll see a lot of franchise tag activity this offseason, but that does remain to be seen. However, we will see a lot of activity in the NFC North, and we're already hearing some rumors about some big-time moves. Now, we'll start with the Detroit Lions. There are a lot of questions in Detroit, mostly centered around that coaching staff after losing both coordinators, one to a division rival, which we'll talk about Ben Johnson here in just a moment. But I think the biggest question with the Lions is how will Dan Campbell do after losing both his coordinators? But my guy, Matt Derry of Locked On Lions, says, don't lose focus of what matters most.
Guys, jump ship. Randall L is going to get more money, go back home to Chicago, be with Ben Johnson. I anticipated Hank Fraley leaving. Him staying is awesome. I love that Kelvin Shepard got the DC job. But these guys, they're all guys that Dan Campbell identified. It's not all elevations from within. Of course, Tanner Engstrand left to go to the Jets, but they're finding people that fit what the Lions do and how the Lions preach their messaging to the players. And so I really like what the staff looks like. Yes, we all should be concerned because Ben Johnson was unreal. Aaron Glenn, the last couple of years, did a fantastic job. These guys were two of the top 5 assistant coaches in all of football, voted on by the AP. I mean, they were in the awards. So those are going to be tough to replace. But remember, talent still wins. We played that Belichick clip from a couple weeks ago on the podcast. Yes, Bill was an excellent coach and had very good coaches on his staff, but you got to have players. And the Lions have players, and they've got now, I think, a pretty good foundation of assistant coaches.
So coaching staff aside, I agree with the general point that you have to have players. The NFL is about having talent and what you can do with that talent. So with that in mind, I think the Detroit Lions are the perfect team to trade for Myles Garrett. Number one, they're in the NFC. And if you don't think that matters, it matters, folks. These teams do not want to trade their best players to teams that they could potentially see down the line. And you could say, well, Cleveland sucks. Why are they worried about that? Well, they are, because things change quickly in the NFL. They do not want to see Myles Garrett in division, in the conference. So I think it's much more likely to see some of these big star players get traded to the opposite conference. Not everybody's the Dallas Mavs who just gives their best player away to someone right down the street from them or anything like that. But as a Lakers fan, I got to work that Luka reference into as many shows as possible. I apologize, since the offseason. But with that in mind, do you agree with me there that Myles Garrett would make a ton of sense for the Lions because it's a different conference? They need to double down on pass rush, and that's a winning team that would make sense for what Myles Garrett wants as well.
Yeah, I think Myles Garrett would make sense for 3 of these 4 NFC North teams, really. But the Lions, if you're trying to go all in and maximize a championship window right now, that's right. A move that can put you over the top. The only reason I hesitate a little bit on it is because, like, I look at this Lions team and they don't have a ton that they're losing in terms of upcoming free agents, right? They're in a pretty good position to run it back. Like, yes, they definitely need to upgrade the pass rush, but it's not as though, like, oh my gosh, they're going to have all these holes. And so, you got to try and raise the whole ship by just like, well, go all in on Myles Garrett then to try and just kind of cover for other things. Like, they don't have to reinvent the whole wheel here. They were super injured last season. Kind of bring pretty much everybody back, augment a little bit with, your normal draft picks and whatever cap space you have. And they should be able to be right back in that NFC championship conversation without a big Myles Garrett splash. So I wonder if, can they just build this a little bit more sustainably without going Los Angeles Rams all in right now? Or is it better off to just go get that Super Bowl? If you feel like, man, this is going to put you over the top, then just go get it. And who cares about the future? Win the ring now and don't worry about sustainability of the success at this point. Just win it and then figure it out later.
Well, Lauren, what I'm going to do right now, if you've ever seen the viral meme of the security guard guy who like grabs the people's guns, and it's so silly because it would never work in real life, but he acts like he's so quick. And I'm going to disarm you, and then I'm going to turn the weapon on you, and I am going to say, because the roster doesn't have a lot of holes, now is the time where you can afford to go all in, because you don't need, like, teams like, I cover the Titans. We want to get as many draft picks as possible because the roster is desolate, want to trade back, want to collect assets to try to have as much possible to build. Well, the Lions have a really good roster right now, so they don't need to hoard those assets as much because they have so many on board. So I think with them being so good and picking so late in the first round and these rounds every year, that it actually makes more sense for them to make this move and go all in because they don't have a lot of holes. And I think they are. Look at the Eagles. They dominated the game with pass rush. Look at the Buccaneers when they beat the Chiefs. They dominated the game with pass rush. Mahomes could barely score in those games. It wasn't that their offense totally outscored them. It was the defense just dominated. So I think if you're the Lions, you look at that and you say, we got to bolster this pass rush in a major way.
I look at the Eagles and I don't see a lot of big money free agent or big money acquisition. AJ Brown's kind of the big one there, but a lot of it is keeping those draft picks, using them every year, and getting cheap players to constantly replenish whenever they lose a pass rusher, whenever they lose an offensive lineman. They've got a draft pick that they've had, for the couple of seasons developing on the bench, so they can just stay cheap and competitive year after year after year, as opposed to blowing everything on one big signing to try and maybe get that one ring, but then you can fall out of favor pretty quickly, as we've seen a couple of teams do over the years.
Very true, but I think one ring for the Detroit Lions would be worth it. And they have Brad Holmes at GM, who came from LA, where they made that move for Stafford when that happened. So I think there's some precedent there. But speaking of cheap and competitive, the Green Bay Packers, all right, they're in a little bit of team turmoil right now because Josh Jacobs is all over Super Bowl Radio Row a couple weeks ago saying they need a true number one wide receiver. All his wide receivers are mad. My guy Peter Bukowski talked about that and that reality and why maybe that's not what the Packers need to do.
You've got a really good, deep group. Jaden Reed's a good player. Christian Watson is a good player who's not going to play most of the year. Romeo Doubs is a good player. Dontavian Wicks is a good player. For a wide receiver 5, Bo Melton is a good player. For a wide receiver 6, Malik Heath is a good player. But do you need someone to be more? You have this question about the future of Romeo Doubs, even just this offseason. Are you going to pay Christian Watson? What is the high-end outcome for Dontavian Wicks, for Jaden Reed? It's a good group of receivers. This was a top 5 passing offense this year with this group, with a quarterback that some of you still think is not very good, kind of. Like this is the amazing part of this is there is a group of fans, both in Green Bay and outside of Green Bay, that go, well, it's all Matt LaFleur, and the receivers stink and the quarterback stinks.
Listen, I don't think that they stink necessarily, but I do think that the Packers are a super young team. And I think if they want to get over the hump of what they've been the last 2 years, they do need some more high-end talent. I think there's this Moneyball approach that the Packers have that works. But may I remind you that I would go back to not their last championship, but the one before. The Packers had to go out and make the splash move with Reggie White to finally put them over the top with those Brett Favre teams in the mid-90s. So I think the Packers do need to make one move here at wide receiver, maybe pass rush. We talked about Myles Garrett being a fit, but I think it would be unwise to bet on the collective good of the group together. I think in the NFL, you do need some star power. Again, I go to the Eagles, who I consistently bet on throughout the season because they just had studs. They just had dudes who will make plays in big moments. The Packers need more of that. They have a good base, but they need high-end talent too.
Yeah, I feel like the Kansas City Chiefs in the Super Bowl illustrated this a little bit too, where it was just like, and they obviously you have Patrick Mahomes, but like when they needed a receiver to make a big play in a big moment, they couldn't find it. And eventually Xavier Worthy caught a couple deep bombs, but the Eagles kind of like Travis Kelce, and even Patrick Mahomes didn't have much he could do with some talent at wide receiver. I mean, Hopkins, those are not bad players; they're good players. But when you don't
not great.
Even just that one great player is all you need. The Packers don't need to blow up their whole receiving core and redo it, but just can you get that one next level difference maker that when push comes to shove, players make plays. And Matt LaFleur can scheme all he wants, but like when it's the fourth quarter in the NFC Championship game, it's 4th and 2, and you just need 2 guys to rise above and beyond. You can't scheme that. You can't make that up. It has to be inherent talent there.
Yeah, it has to be there. And I think I forget exactly who said this recently in NFL media, whether it was just a Titans thing. It might have been Titans coach Brian Callahan, or it could have been like a Daniel Jeremiah type talking about the draft. But I've seen where people say your team needs 7 difference makers. And the quarterback needs to be one of those guys. Doesn't need to be elite, but a difference maker, which Jalen Hurts is a perfect example of. He can make a huge difference in the game while not being Patrick Mahomes level at quarterback. But you look at the Packers, and it's just hard for me to look at, despite their team being a ton of bees up and down the roster, which is great. Where are their 7 difference makers? I think Xavier McKinney is a difference maker. Rashawn Gary could be a difference maker, but he wasn't last year. He had a down year statistically. So I just think the Packers need more of those difference makers, because they have they're a really good, solid theater cast, but they don't have the leads. They don't have the people to really elevate the talent with the main actors who can get it done. So that's what I see with the Green Bay Packers, but I know they're still a good football team.
Well, it's so easy to just go out there and get difference makers. Why don't they just go add a couple? It's perfect. Yeah, just draft studs and sign perfect free agents. It's easy. Why don't they just do that?
Well, I think the Packers, who are historically a conservative team, who trades down and collects picks and tries to do it smart, maybe in this window, while they need to get a little bit more aggressive and trade for Myles Garrett or bring back Davante Adams. Just saying, could be an option for them. But we'll move to the other 2 teams in the NFC North, where Lauren obviously knows a little bit of what we might be talking about. All right, Lauren, let's continue today's edition of Locked On NFL. We talked about some franchise tag candidates. We talked about 2 teams in the NFC North, the Lions and the Packers. But now I want to get into the other 2 teams, and we'll start with Lauren's beloved Chicago Bears here. And we talked about the Lions losing their coaches, which we obviously see the other side of that coin with the Bears adding Ben Johnson as head coach, which I think is the best hire of the offseason. We'll see how things shake out, but I do like the fit there. How much of a bump do you think the Bears are going to get here with Ben Johnson? How much just Ben Johnson is your head coach instead of Matt Eberflus and Thomas Brown? How big of an impact do you think that makes just right away, immediately?
Yeah, I mean, there's a certain amount of just like respectability and like adulting that comes into the room that way, not just with Ben Johnson, but Dennis Allen coming in as defensive coordinator, like guys with experience, guys with success, at least Allen as a coordinator, not so much as a head coach there. And, Eric Bieniemy on offense, like there's just a certain amount of like people who know how to do this and have done it successfully and have seen what winning successful culture looks like, as opposed to like, Eberflus came from Indianapolis where things were kind of okay there. And they built an offensive coach or a coaching staff kind of full of a bunch of different cooks in the kitchen that never worked together before and had come from different backgrounds. And you shouldn't really have that sort of pedigree. So like simple things like communication, accountability, discipline will be so much better. And that's going to go a long way, but maybe only as far as, the roster upgrades have to follow suit, especially that offensive line is going to be really critical to Ben Johnson fulfilling his potential in Chicago.
Well, I think we go back to, we just had a whole conversation about, it's about the players at the end of the day. The coaching is so good. So I agree with you. But what I would say is, I thought the Bears had a better roster than what their win-loss record said last year. I thought the Bears have a pretty solid, they're like every team in the NFL. They're not without holes and flaws and areas where they need to get better. The nature of the NFL is you can never be great at literally all of those positions up and down the board unless you're the Philadelphia Eagles, apparently. But I think that Chicago is better than what they looked like last year. I like the talent on the roster. So while they need improvements, I think that with Ben Johnson, they could get a big-time immediate bump. And I would also say it's not just about the stability of the coaching staff, but now you have a guy who's still in the division that he was coaching in before and knows how to attack these defenses and what he wants to do and has answers for different things. Will he have the players that can execute those answers? We will see, but I don't think it's too far off. I'm going to probably have the Chicago Bears as a playoff team next year.
I think the Bears are going to be a really interesting case study in this conversation of like players versus coaching. Because what we were just talking about with Green Bay and like difference makers, I think after the last couple of years in Chicago, there's some questions about guys who like are good, but are they great? And was coaching keeping them from being the difference there? Like Montez Sweat is a great example. Had 10 sacks when the Bears first traded for him, but a little bit of a down year last year. Like, is he a true difference maker pass rusher? And the coaching staff was part of what was holding him back, or is there a lack of talent there? I mean, and the linebackers, TJ Edwards and Tremaine Edmonds, like they're very good, but they weren't, especially Edmonds, third highest paid linebacker in NFL, did not play that way last season. Is he great, or was it a coach? Will coaching get him back to that? DJ Moore is the number one wide receiver. Like, is he that difference maker wide receiver? Cole Kmet at tight end. Like, all these guys are like teetering on that line of like, maybe with good coaching, they can be those sevens difference makers, or maybe the coaching staff comes in and we realize, oh, it wasn't coaching. Those guys just aren't elite players.
I guess personally, just my opinion, I think that Sweat, Jalen Johnson at corner, DJ Moore, I think those are three difference makers. That, to me, they would qualify and check that box, in my opinion. So I think that's a good base, and I guess that's where my optimism for the Bears comes from during this conversation. But do want to look at the Minnesota Vikings, who we talked about with the Sam Darnold franchise tag situation, and I think this kind of dovetails perfectly in with that, because the real question for Minnesota going through this offseason to me is J.J. McCarthy. That's it. And it's not free agent move they can make, trade they can make, draft pick, anything like that. The big question for Minnesota is J.J. McCarthy going to at least be close enough to Sam Darnold last year for you to replicate what you did? I think that's going to be the biggest question. And right now, I don't know how anybody could answer that question with any kind of certainty with the little, like, not even just last year. Michigan minimized J.J. McCarthy purposefully on their path to a chip. They thought the most winningest path that we can take is to minimize this quarterback. Let's do everything we can to not put the game in his hands and win with the other aspects. And now we don't see him. So it's not just his 1 year missed in the NFL. It's the way that Michigan chose to play in college. I have my doubts here, but Minnesota does have a pretty good support system around him to replicate some of that Michigan stuff.
Yeah, like in theory, if he can just kind of game manage Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, TJ Hawkinson, and you keep the offensive line strong in front of him, and they got to figure out what they're doing at running back for the long-term future. But like that should be in theory enough to be a very good team. And then along the way, you can still be a little bit patient with JJ McCarthy and say, hey, you don't have to be the hero who does everything right away. Just kind of Alex Smith your way through the first year, and then we can become more like a Jalen Hurts, down the line kind of progression is, I think, the ideal sort of way you go, where you go from guy who's, I've heard that, the trailer being pulled along to the truck pulling the trailer. You can't rush this and expect him to be 4,000 yard, perfect Pro Bowl quarterback who's going to take you to the NFC Championship game in his first year as a starter.
This may seem simple, and it probably is, but just checking. If you had to take one of these guys going forward for the next 4 seasons, would you take Bo Nix or J.J. McCarthy?
Well, am I getting – because I think Bo Nix –
No, you don't. You're the coach.
Bo Nix in Sean Payton's system is such a nice fit, and I think Kevin O'Connell should work well for J.J. McCarthy, but it's tough when you've seen Bo Nix.
Yeah.
Right? And McCarthy – and I was not a big McCarthy fan coming out of the draft, so –
I was not a big Nix fan, or McCarthy fan for that matter.
Yeah, so I lean Bo Nix, but like McCarthy's got Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison. So it's like, I think that's a really good question.
Well, hey, it's worth saying, if Bo Nix was that good with the Broncos supporting cast, what would he do in Minnesota? I think at this point you kind of got to say Bo Nix, but it's kind of a shifty question. No doubt about it.
Yeah, so. I agree. I agree there. Like Nix has done it, so that's where it is. But you can see, Vikings fans should be optimistic about McCarthy too. Like there's obviously something there. It's just a matter of what that looks like.
Hey, until you see him fail, hope springs, eternal. So I don't blame Minnesota Vikings fans for staying optimistic.
Keep telling yourself that for whoever the Titans add at quarterback this year.
Oh God, yeah, man. We're gonna have to talk about that on this show at some point in time. I'm avoiding it, but it's definitely a big topic. Right. Yeah, it's funny to me that all the TV shows and everything that talk about the NFL constantly, it's all just like the Titans should trade because they want the quarterbacks to go to more exciting teams. But I don't know. It's tough. Not a great year to have the number 1 pick. Classic Titans move. But with that being said, we will move right along here. NFC North. Very exciting division. Went AFC North, NFC North, because those are probably my two favorite divisions in football. If I'm honest with you, AFC West is right up there too. Surprisingly, didn't see that coming. But we're going to keep rolling through these divisional previews. And then there's obviously big news. We'll get franchise tag stuff coming up. But that's going to do it for us today. Thanks for tuning in. I am your host, the Madman, Tyler Rowland, with my co-host, Lauren Cox. Again, thanks for tuning in to Locked On NFL. And as I tell you every episode, stay safe out there.